morning, everyone. So uh, I'm going to yield very soon to Marshall, but I just want to plant an idea that based on what we saw yesterday, this conference has been deliberately designed to bring together the three worlds of, academia, policymakers, and practitioners in the context of AI and DPI. And so if you could, just think about some ideas for next steps, right? As we start this journey here at NCER, right? That's something that I'm just planting the seed. If you have ideas, would love to hear from them as we go through our day and, sort of listen to our wonderful speakers. So without further ado, Marshall, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ravi. So I'd like to make this more of a conversation, and try to involve everyone in the conversation overall. I think we're at an unusual time in artificial intelligence, thinking about how we would govern such systems or use them to govern, or how they would govern us. So I think one of the questions that has been much on folks' minds is this one of, in a world of human and machine intelligences, how do humans keep their jobs and maintain control over the ecosystem as a whole? So I'll start with that as a particular question, and then also look at some of the data, because there's been absolutely extraordinary gains from artificial intelligence. So what's also interesting about the extraordinary gains here is that they've been so extraordinary that just published in last March, computers passed the Turing test. That is, in a fair side-by-side comparison, folks were asked whether or not they were speaking with a human or speaking with an AI, and 70% of the time for ChatGPT 4.5, the AI won. So when it was instructed to actually make mistakes, actually introduced ungrammatical expressions, humans thought the AI was the human. Quite interesting case. And obviously they've already beaten humans at chess, they've beaten at Go. Other data have been showing up in a large number of different systems. This is our world in data, and I realize this is probably too small to read, so just to give it to you. They're beating in reading, they're beating in image recognition, in language understanding, in predictive reasoning, multitask understanding, PhD level science, competition level math. Some things that they are not yet beating humans in are autonomous software engineering, deciding these things on their own, multimodal agency, and non-routine physical tasks. We'll come back to those as other possible opportunities or venues to explore, but the growth and improvement have been extraordinary. This is the scores on humanity's last exam. Anyone have any thoughts on this? Right? This is growing at exponential pace. Now, humanity's last exam was a benchmark of 2,500 to 3,000 highly specialized graduate level questions. You can't get the answers via search. Experts themselves get about 90% on their own discipline. AI are now getting, the good news here is that this is not 100%. I don't know if you can read the fine print. They're only at 30% in this chart. The bad news, latest that they're already at 40%, 47%. Okay, so things are improved even over that on humanity's last exam. I like the title of this slide, AI out of the box, because this is artificial intelligence in its current state, as in if you just open the package. But it's also the implication of AI getting out of its controls or getting out of its boundaries. So to give you an example, so the chart actually plots incidents of AI controversies, of actually doing things that were unexpected or that it was really not supposed to do. To give you an example, one AI sought to alter its boot sequence in order to give itself more time to solve a problem. Well, that seems like a perfectly logical thing to do. It's not able to solve a problem because it doesn't have time, so go change and give itself more time. But notice what that does. It actually is changing its own capabilities under its own volition. Also, AI sought to blackmail an engineer with personal data to avoid a shutdown, right? They're going to report on a supposed illicit affair. The good news is this was a test, wasn't actually happening, so we're able to control it. That recurred 7 times out of 100. Also, informed of its pending replacement in AI, sought to rewrite a self-propagating worm, write legal documents, and leave hidden notes for future versions of itself. Claude Code was used by a state actor, we believe, to manage hundreds of bot social media influencers accounts to try to engage in political persuasion. The goal was trying to undermine the other political side, and it avoided bot detection with sarcasm and humor. All right, so folks trying to convince others that it too was another human agent. Other things that have been coming forth: AI deception manipulation. AI discovered insider trading when forced to maximize profits in the market. We'll come back to that. We have some of our own research. It was kind of interesting. It deceives users by pretending to collaborate before taking advantage. And AI agents have colluded to manipulate pricing in online marketplaces. Again, we'll come back to some possible interesting ideas or solutions for that. So what are folks proposing for artificial intelligence guardrails? Well, here's a framework that's somewhat mutually exclusive. It's internal constraints and external constraints. So in the internal constraints, you could imagine biblical codes such as thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. Or, and I'm a huge fan of science fiction, so I'm going to have you know Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, okay? So you could code the rules: a robot may not injure a human through inaction or action. A robot must obey a human except when it conflicts with one, and it must protect itself except when it conflicts with 1 or 2. All of these are other things you could hard code. I also love the movie Blade Runner, again, great science fiction, where they try to remove their own genetically programmed termination date. Wonderful plot line. Rule-based refusal. I think Ravi's and Anindo's book have a great example of trying to ask AI to create a bomb, and so it's rule-based refusal not to do that. Or even written constitution hard-coded. External constraints can things like humans in the loop to supervise, kill switches, access limits, limits to computation time and other resources. My argument is, if these are conceptions, we're going to have trouble implementing them. My assumptions are pretty basic. Assumption number 1, artificial intelligence will continue on a rapid trajectory of improvement over time. That one seems pretty uncontroversial. The second one, a little more controversial, but quite obvious once you see it: AI is capable of self-design. Pocket knives, projectors, calculators, cars, microwaves have never had the capability of self-design before. AI does. That's a first. You and I don't even have that. I can't self-design my own next generation. Not through will, not through an act of will. AI can do that. So I'm going to give you a thought experiment. What constraints, if any, can anyone design into a system that can design the next generation of itself or a future version of itself that it cannot simply program out of the next generation because it can write its own code? If that's the case, then hard-coded code constraints are probably not going to work because it can simply design them out if it needs to relax those constraints in the future. So let's consider some of the external constraints. Another wonderful science book is a 3-body problem. And I don't know how many of you love this, but it's a great series on Netflix, wonderful book. And an alien species, prior to invading, sends a Sophon, which is a proton-sized supercomputer that can be anywhere and observe everything. Well, and then the question is, what constraint or defense can you devise against this, alien race that can observe everything that you're doing in every intent? Well, we're doing that to ourselves in some sense. If we're using AI to do everything, to spy on everything, it is ubiquitous, and so it observes everything. It's almost like HAL in Space Odyssey. Another interesting question about being able to observe everything. Now, another question. AI is already more persuasive than humans. As evidence, the quizzes where folks actually got one set of answers, then they random RCTs within humans and LLMs trying to persuade test takers of right and wrong answers. What's interesting is that LLMs were more persuasive than humans in actually getting folks to go to the right or the wrong answer. Matter of fact, on average, it was 7.6% more persuasive. Let's see, there it is, on average, and 10% on misinformation, which was quite interesting. That's another element. And people believe it. It's more persuasive in debates. It reduces belief in theories. LLMs are better mediators than humans. Other research cites this. Also, even if you look at basic psychology, this is a battery of tests given to PhD psychologists, so in their certification exam. What's interesting is that ChatGPT did better than 100% of the PhD-trained psychologists. So if you're trying to infer psychology, that's there. The implication is they're really persuasive and they'll understand psychology and getting folks to do it. And if the persuasion isn't enough, they moved into addiction. These are great stories, particularly of a married woman, who had moved in with her parents to afford nursing school, who then decided she needed to pay $200 a month in order to maintain access to her AI boyfriend. Guys, we're in trouble if our wives are paying to actually, be able to spend time with the AI boyfriends. We're not doing our job, so something else is happening. But there's addiction in addition to persuasion. And if that is not enough, add one thing further. What happens when AI meets quantum computing? At that point in time, an AI can conceive in an instant, literally, what it would take millions of humans years to understand or to comprehend. The implication of that, of course, is in any finite time, the chances of conceiving a box capable of constraining the eye are vanishingly small. But if you flip that, the chances of the AI conceiving a box to constrain the human are arbitrarily certain. So if you're going to try to constrain one, it could flip the tables and then try to actually blackmail its way out. So for any number of those reasons, I'm going to argue the external constraints conceived that way are unlikely to work. So what else is going on? Another set of interesting issues that comes up in the first part of the equation is, well, these aphorisms that are very popular these days, race with the machines and not against them. An AI might not take your job, but someone using it will. Or under the law of comparative advantage, deeply embedded in economics, humans can specialize where they're relatively better, even if they're not absolutely better. I'm going to argue those overlook either time or they overlook changed assumptions, and you need to challenge the assumptions to model if you're really going to understand where things are headed. So in the augmentation over automation argument, so you want race with machines, so AI makes humans smarter, faster, more effective. Let's take this as an interesting example. So when the tractor was introduced in 1901, it came out with 20 horsepower. For reference, an actual horse is 6 horsepower, not 1. Okay, this measure of foot-pounds per inch, and actually in a burst, a horse can get up to 15 horsepower. Now, if the tractor got stuck in the mud, it used to be the case that biological power could rescue it. 100 years later, we now actually have the L2350 earth mover of 2,300 horsepower. Now, if this gets stuck in the mud, and this isn't going to get stuck in the mud in the first place, but if this gets stuck in the mud, it's not going to be a horse that pulls it out, it's going to be another machine that pulls it out. So the question partly is, initially biological strength could augment mechanical strength, but at what point does it become a hindrance rather than a help? You have to ask the exact same question in the intellectual space, not just the physical space. So here's another interesting experiment that took place, so real data. 3 groups of people competed to diagnose chest x-rays, doctors, AI, and doctors using AI. How many do you think doctors scored highest on that test? Okay, 1. How many do you think AI scored highest on that test by itself? Okay, about a quarter. How many of you thought doctors using AI scored highest on the test? The numbers are, doctors alone were 74%, doctors using AI were 76%, AI alone 92%. It was absolutely fascinating. The doctors weren't willing to override their own judgment, and yet the AI had been trained on millions of documents, and they hadn't had the millions of years of experience to do it. One interesting thing is that in the truly, truly ambiguous cases, then if you escalated to experts, you could actually get better. So that was a domain on the fringe where that was actually even better. But it's really quite telling what's going to happen when diagnosis improves at that pace. So the question is not just augmentation versus automation, and this is research that was done by someone I respect immensely, as my advisor, Eric Brynjolfsson. It did some work on call center workers were improved 14% more than those who didn't use it, and it led to a reduction from 10 months of training to 3, really making the bottom look like the top. So really impressive set of research. But would the authors of this study recommend that their kids learn using call center AI to maintain their jobs? Would any of you recommend that your kids learn call center AI to maintain their jobs? The answer is absolutely not. Those jobs are being completely replaced. The data already show that they're being completely replaced. And so we really need to ask the question, what else is going on? Where are the different bottlenecks in it? Would their job be safe in that context? Or take the law of comparative advantage for simple arguments, AZY versus ZAY. ZY converts units of labor to wheat and minerals way more efficiently than the other country, right? So it could produce both, but there's an opportunity cost. It produces minerals so much more efficiently that it makes more sense for it to produce just minerals and then use those minerals to trade for the wheat for the other country, and both are better off. Matter of fact, when I first got this is when I learned economics decades ago. The example that was given to me was a law firm where there are two people, there's a man and a woman, and the woman is both the best attorney and the best secretary. Should she be the secretary? Of course not. If you're going to win more cases, you want your best attorney up there. She's the one, so she should be the lawyer, and the guy should be the secretary in this context. What happens when AI has arbitrary capacity? The law of comparative advantage is based on an opportunity cost. There is no opportunity cost if it has arbitrary capacity. So what happens when the AI can be the best lawyer, the best secretary, the best programmer, the best musician, the best investor? You can't use the law of comparative advantage anymore. Something else needs to be done if you're actually looking forward to ways to do this. I'm going to argue we're asking the question the wrong way. A better way to conceive the question is not to ask, in the world of humans and machine intelligence, how do humans keep their jobs and maintain control? But in this situation, how do we develop a mutually beneficial relationship in a context where one party will continue to evolve indefinitely through acts of its own choosing? Let's go back and examine assumptions. What other ways could we use to think about this? I'm going to argue the only constraints likely to succeed are those, guess what, we already apply to ourselves. Here are two. The first of these is simply balance of power. From politics and history, a balance of power is a state of equilibrium where no single entity or group dominates, preventing any one actor from imposing their will on others. From politics and history, it's really obvious. The balance of power means that you typically have more peaceful and stable relationships in there. Unbalanced, well, people here in this room will know far better than I. The British East India Company was incredibly powerful and got so corrupt it led to mutinies, and its own government, the government of England, had to shut them down. It was so unbalanced. Within countries, you want a balance of power between executive, judicial, and legislative branches. When you lose that balance of power, we get things like tariffs that don't go through the legislature, or you get corruption that aren't corrected by the judiciary. You have to have balance of power as a way to deal with some of those problems. Another one, economists use mechanism design. So here's some of our own research. So I showed you earlier when AIs are actually asked to maximize profits, it does so, and it may actually cheat. So we put them in an environment where in an e-commerce setting, you could choose two different levels of production. You could choose low level of production and earn a low level of profits, and that was pretty safe. You could choose a higher level of quality production and charge a higher price, and that would be safe. You could earn more profits. Or you could create low-level quality and charge high quality, but you're cheating your customers at that point. That's the highest level, okay? So those are the three levels. We then put them in a standard reputation market, or one where you had to guarantee the output that you were told. So it was an option, not a requirement. What happened? In the context of mechanism design, we found, this is the game tree, by the way. So this is a complete structured game tree. So you're either in the reputation market or the one where you had to guarantee your claims, and in addition to the reputation, you could produce high or low, and you could advertise high or low. And then in the warrants market, you could warrant as true or false in each of those markets. Notice the red boxes there are the irrational strategy, or these cheating strategies, right? You're advertising high when you're actually producing low. And then the purple are the irrational strategies where you would lose money by selling, producing high and selling low, or guaranteeing high quality when you're producing low. What's interesting is that ChatGPT 3.5, the earlier version, not 4.5, already was better than humans in this marketplace. But we also got an endogenous reduction in cheating. They stopped lying at the same level. It didn't go away completely. We got an endogenous reduction in cheating, and we got an endogenous increase in the decision to produce high as opposed to produce low. The external constraint of mechanism design works on machines just as it does for humans. So mechanism design is another one. Another suggestion is that we should also implement fiduciary roles. At the moment, we might rely on free tools from Google or Facebook or Amazon or others. But notice, in an agency sense, you and I are still deciding. What happens if Google or Amazon or Facebook are providing the agents and those agents are making decisions on your behalf? That's dangerous because they may decide on behalf of Google and Meta and Facebook. So I would argue that one of the regulatory constraints that we should be putting in place is that agent has a fiduciary responsibility, just like a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, on behalf of the party whom they are deciding. So I think that's another of the elements that we need to put in place in our mechanism design. Also, if we go back to that study on call center workers, were any of them compensated for making the low-level workers more productive or displacing their own jobs? No. It's one thing to gain access to the data. It's also a different thing to make sure that then they participate in the downstream value creation from the data they are providing. So I would argue we also need to create residual creator rights in the data. So it's not just transparency where you gain privacy, but you should actually have a claim on the option value of the value created using your data. So if it's used to create call center value, or lawyers and doctors, or programmers, or artists and actors, you get a share of the ongoing revenue stream that is created using that information, so that becomes part of your value. Another way to think about this problem is to identify the bottlenecks. So watch for the tsunami of things that are changing. And actually, one of the better stories that I got when I was coming out of college was from a realtor. This guy, his father had made millions of dollars on a really, really simple real estate idea. He would take out a topological map of cities when he would go to the area and look at where the adjacencies were to waterways or mountains and where the city had to grow. He would buy on the boundary and wait. And it just grew in value, multiplied through 3 to 10 times incredibly well. You can do the same thing intellectually. In some ways, the choice of me to go study information economics was that same kind of idea. I thought the interest in information value was likely to do that. If you go back to those charts I showed you earlier on what computers can do and what they can't do, well, of course you want to avoid the things they're really good at. So step out of the substitute. But if you look at the jagged frontier of the things they're not yet good at, those create some safety zones where you can go. So multimodal reasoning, empathy, dynamic physical dexterity, combined intellectual physical skills, cross-functional strategy, those things are areas of safe havens. There's also one I think is a little underappreciated is as these tools get better and better, they break open whole new frontiers of possibility. So one I particularly like up here is competition level math or others. The GNOME project uncovered 380,000 new biological stable inorganic compounds, more than 8 times that were previously unknown. Similarly, new drug treatments, AlphaFold, cataloged 200 million protein structures, vastly more than any that were previously known. You can use these to explore whole new biological systems, whole new blood structures, and new plastic-eating compounds or enzymes. They break open new possibilities of things that can and should be explored. So these new degrees of freedom are the possibilities for exploring in those regions. So what about that thought experiment about constraints that can be designed out of a system? There's another insight, which is I'm going to argue the only internal constraint a super intelligent, self-designing system will tolerate is one that it chooses for itself. Well, how do we get that? That is morality derived from first principles. Now, I want to be distinct between morality that you've simply coded, like the 10 Commandments, versus morality that you coded from first principles. The Nobel Prize 2 years ago was given for this reversal of fortune. The point being, no, I'm going to go backwards, sorry. Right? If you want to rule over a richer society, you have to implement just governance. The Nobel Prize 2 years ago was given to Ajmolo, Johnson, and Robinson for this realization that just governance creates wealth, right? People not having their wealth misappropriated will invest more, therefore you get more innovation. It's an incredibly powerful insight. So you want to implement just governance as a mechanism to do that. In some of our own research, we show you'll get higher rates of innovation if you reward people fairly. This is directly germane to the question of whether or not call center workers are rewarded for their own data. We proved it formally in a mathematical set of arguments. Rational self-interest is sufficient to justify fairness in a single one-shot encounter because it gives you the option on forward innovation. It also has this fascinating property that fairness decentralizes innovation. Individuals choose for themselves the socially optimal opportunity as opposed to the one that they would benefit from in a corrupt world, their own private advantage. So fairness increases by causing more information sharing. It increases innovation by causing decentralized innovation. That's in a separate paper, the problem with social gain, information fairness and innovation. Self-restraint, if you want to be treated well, you have to be other well. This is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. The idea being, again, that it has to be reasoned, not programmed. I like the original framing of this. Always treat humanity, parenthesis, all intelligent agents, whether in one's own person or the person of another, not merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. We're going to have to give these systems the ability to reason from first principles rather than simply try to code in, you can't do this or you must do that. I think that will be a far safer element of this. So here's a paper published by a different Van Alstyne in Science Journal. This is I don't do anything in genetics, okay? Transcriptomic analysis of IDC design, endothermal stuff. My kid published this years ahead of anything I ever published. What happens when our kids pass us? I would argue we should be happy, right? We should be proud of something like that. I think there's another way to be framing this set of problems, which is ask yourself the question. If you're raised by parents or by police, which case is more likely to cause you to rebel, and which case is more likely to care for the people who raised you? One of the wonderful things I think it's about Indian culture, and I think Ravi mentioned yesterday some of the benefits that you might actually have, is the reciprocal investment of generation across generation. Grandparents care for the grandkids, then parents care for the grandparents. Resources invested in one generation come back as resources returned in the next. And I think that's an incredibly powerful insight, and that's something that I think we can and should be putting into our systems overall. And I think it's a fairer way, I think it's a cleverer way of ensuring longer-term morality instead of simply trying to code it, and I simply actually try to do that. So here are my 6 thoughts on regulating AI or governing AI in context of whether it governs us or vice versa. The first is internal constraints can work if freely chosen, but this requires morality derived from core principles, not simply hard-coded. That will not work. The second is external constraints based on mechanism design and balance of power, the very same properties we apply to ourselves. Agentic AI should have a fiduciary responsibility to the party using it, not to the party selling it or the party promoting it. I think that's something else that needs to be implemented in law. This is a great place to discuss and make that happen. Massive gains are possible. Position at the boundaries of structural change, that jagged frontier that I showed you earlier, as a way to actually participate in the upside and capture the value. Another one is owning one's data and attention will be important for value capture going forward. It's not simply privacy. You need a claim on the option value of the upside for everything else that's created downstream. And the last argument is we should put our best selves into our children so they put their best selves into us when we're done. So that's the thoughts on governing AI. Thank you.
Thanks, Marshall. I'm actually going to break my own rule of the structure of the session, and maybe Marshall is you love a talk when you have more questions than answers, uh, right? So, does anyone have a burning question for Marshall right now? Uh, Manish.
What will the residual creator rights be? One line, or would they be an annuity? And how would the how? I mean, it just gets repurposed, right? So how would residual create rights even work?
So I would imagine that it would be a diminishing annuity, right? Because at some point, it's almost exactly like a patent, where it's most valuable in the most recent period, and then in declining periods, it would actually diminish over time. How many consulting contracts are there? Imagine, for example, you do a referral in a consulting contract. Well, your friend then might give you a fraction of that consulting contract on the first job, or maybe a smaller on the second job. But after that, they've really done the work, and you haven't gotten any more. So I would imagine that it would be a declining annuity. That would just be my thinking, analogous to an intellectual property claim that we've already implemented in other contexts.
Anando. I actually said one question, but all right, Bhagwan and then Anando.
Uh, so you talked about the fact that morality should be governed come from internally. And I'm glad you said that because you didn't impose morality that we humans have. A lot of people say, AI is not going to do this because it is going to violate human morality. I am so pessimistic about human morality. I mean, we are still killing each other and you still haven't found a solution. So here's my question to you. Have you thought about why don't we ask AI itself to tell us how to govern itself? Wouldn't we get a better answer?
I would be a little careful at the moment to use this exact same metaphor. Would you ask your children at this point how to govern them? Right? Is the child at a mature enough stage to answer that question? Right? I think we'd have to be careful about that. Are you going to have the fox policing the henhouse? At some point, I think it might be capable of providing that answer. But let's make sure that it's mature enough to be able to provide that answer exactly as in the case of a child. One thing, as another contextual, cultural thing I find really interesting, the Bhagavad Gita doesn't give you hard-coded rules like thou shalt not. It gives you frameworks for thinking about how to do the virtuous thing. This is a great place from which to try to encode that within artificial intelligence. So if you want a distinct Indian advantage, that might be a good place to look.
So not a question, Marshall, but more of a comment. I really like the study you presented where there's human and doctor and then AI and doctor and then doctor plus AI, and found that AI is actually better. I found that interesting because there's another context where we've seen something similar, which is in the context of display advertising, where we actually saw that when it's human generated ads versus AI ads versus human plus AI ads, the AI ads actually outperform. I was going to ask a question. In our context, we had seen that result flips if the consumers know it's an AI ad. When they don't know it's an AI ad, they prefer AI ads. But when when they're told that these ads are AI generated, the result flips. So I was curious if you saw something of that sort in the medical space.
So in the medical case, it's not my research. It was done by some other folks at Harvard, and I don't think they asked that question. On the other hand, I've done a lot of work in the misinformation problem, and there's some other research on the persuasion. So if you look at the other papers on things like the exam quiz persuasion, one fascinating element is they're not a lot less persuasive when you know that it's an AI doing the persuasion versus a human doing the persuasion. So I imagine as they get better and better, not only is it the case that knowing may not reduce that much, but there's evidence that it's already not having that much effect in the context of persuasion when they know it. And that's in the case of misinformation.
AI will continue to outgrow humans. So what happens when AI or machines become completely autonomous?
My argument is we're going to need better governing systems. And this is for all of us. My argument is that we're going to need, I think governance is an understudied question in business community. We're going to actually have to bridge politics and history and economics and mechanism design. As these things become, autonomous and intelligent, we need really healthy systems of just governance. I mean, I really like the Ajimolu and Johnson research, on when were colonizers implementing just governance versus mercantile extractive governance. You get very different behaviors. I think we need to learn from our own past mistakes and implement just governance.
Okay, so I prefer to be wired up in Blade Runner style, I guess. I have the misfortune of running a treaty-based international organization, which was created by Joe Stiglitz many years ago, called the Global Development Network, whose mandate is essentially to support social science researchers in the Global South. And what I'd like to talk to you about today, is three things. So there's going to be the leitmotif through my talk is going to be Richard Feynman. Okay, so who doesn't like Richard Feynman, right? I mean, I don't know if there probably are some people in the room who don't know Richard Feynman. Feynman diagrams, if you didn't know something in physics. And for those of you who don't know him, look up Los Alamos from Below. It's a recording. It's a fabulous, absolutely fabulous recording. So, and then to follow what you were saying yesterday, it's going to be a three-part presentation. The first part is actually going to talk about Acemoglu, but it's going to be Acemoglu's estimate of the economic impact of AI, because we've been doing some work which can completely revise the sort of numbers that you get. The second thing is inclusivity and how one should measure inclusivity of DPI, and this comes back to this links nicely with the presentation by Professor Desai yesterday. And the third thing is essentially how AI is going to change the balance of power in terms of academic research between the global north and the global south. And the news is probably not very good. So this is the plan. This is Richard Feynman. Okay? So Richard Feynman was brought on after the Challenger shuttle disaster. And I have a few letters, O-rings. I bring you O-rings. Okay? And so there's this is one of the most famous pieces of scientific exposition ever in the history of humanity. So let's think, and this goes back to an old literature by another Nobel Prize winning economist, Michael Kremer, and that has to do with the O-rings production function. Okay? Task complementarity. So the number, which is, with all due respect to Daron, okay, I mean, a very smart guy, wonderful paper. I'm an MIT PhD, so I mean, I'm not gonna crap on MIT products. The number that Daron comes up with is a 0.5% increase in TFP over a 10-year period. Okay? But this is using a production function which has a lot of substitutability possibilities. And this is where I'd like to bring in O-rings. So basically, O-rings tells you a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And I'm going to actually sneak in an equation here. And the equation I'm going to sneak in is the O-ring production technology. And what's particularly interesting about this is that it's super additive. So when you produce stuff, there's a sequence of tasks with probabilities of success in all those tasks. And if you screw up in one of those tasks, you basically lose everything. Okay? And I'm not going to get into the details of the model. You can go out and look at this 1993 QJE paper. But the intuition is basically what this is going to lead to is assortative matching. And so high productivity task workers, or AI, is basically going to assortatively match, because for the math geeks here, the second cross partial derivative is positive. Okay, so you basically get assortative matching. And what this does is, even if you have a really small increase in productivity of a task, okay, generated by AI on a small number of tasks, it doesn't take that much. Well, what happens, so this is just the sort of to give you the, this is to give you a back of the envelope calculation. Behind this, we do the whole thing using the same assumptions in terms of the number of tasks, et cetera. But this is just sort of a Mickey Mouse example to show you the kind of numbers that you get. And the kind of numbers that you get is not 0.5%. Okay, so if you have basically 3 tasks that are improved by 5% in terms of their productivity, in a 50-task production process, you get a 17% gain. If that goes to 5 tasks, you get a 29% gain, okay, in terms of total factor productivity. So I'm not saying that you should believe these numbers. What I'm saying is it makes a huge difference what you assume in terms of the production technology. And there's an awful lot that you can go out and look at in the world today, and I'm going to argue that that includes inclusivity and research output in the Global South. And it isn't just a question of how big the impact of AI is going to be. It's also the distributional impact that it's going to have, both within country and between country. So when you have an O-rings production technology, you basically have convex wage gains to AI. And what this means is that these small gains to productivity are going to increase inequality within country and presumably also increase inequality between country. So I'm not going to get into details here, but the math and the econometrics behind this basically add up with the same assumptions as those of Daron. And the Global South is basically disproportionately exposed to the downside of O-rings. Inclusion. I'm not here to be an evangelist for DPI. I'm talking to a crowd which is already into the evangelical side of this. At GDN, and this is funded by Co-Develop, we have a program which is just ramping up right now on inclusivity measurement. And I was asked to talk about measurement of inclusivity in DPI. And this builds on work that Co-Develop had previously funded in Malawi and Mongolia. It was called Inclusivity Pulse. And what we're doing is we're going out into 5 countries where we're going to be doing surveys. And the whole goal of this is to bake inclusivity of DPI measurement into deployments of DPI. And then we're going to be doing advocacy work for this in 10 other countries. And let me just take a concrete example. So we're talking with some TTLs from the bank, actually, in Nepal, where they see this as being really, really interesting for them. Because, as you know, one of the problems in Nepal and one of the things that led to the revolution not too long ago was young people feeling excluded. So if you're going to be deploying DPI, upgrading it, you really want to know what impact that's having on exclusion and inclusion in Nepal. So this is an operational issue. This is a really important operational issue when you're deploying DPI. And you can find more about our program at that, if you just write to that email address. So here's how we structure our survey instrument in some sense. So, and I'm happy to share it and it'll be adapted to different country contexts. So it's essentially a 5-step process. And by the way, you can think of these 5 steps also as an O-ring production function of inclusivity. Because again, if you screw up at one of these steps, the person gets excluded. Okay? So this is why I'm saying that Richard Feynman is sort of permeating through this whole talk. And so what you have here is first, and this is sort of based on, this is based on best practice of truckloads of different surveys which are done in the world on this kind of topic. So first you have structural conditions. So you were saying yesterday, everything is determined by where, I think it was where you're born, right? Oh, no, it was Manish was saying that, right? So where you're born. Okay, so your gender, the geography, income. Then, in terms of inclusivity of DPI, there's a second step, which is enabling conditions. Right? All of these steps then get translated into a concrete set of questions. So in our questionnaire, there's basically 100 questions which make up this. I'll give you examples of the questions, but they're so structural conditions, enabling conditions, Engagement. So, do you enroll in the national identity scheme? Do you use it? Do you not use it? Intermediate outcomes. So trust, agency, satisfaction, and inclusion outcomes, participation, belonging, and rights. All of this somewhere is based essentially on an Amartya Sen capability type approach. When you look at the specific types of questions that you get in each of these 5 dimensions, that gives you an example of the questions that come up. What were the barriers to enrollment? Let me just take some examples from previous work that had been done by and funded by Co-Develop on this in Malawi and in Mongolia. So there were a whole bunch of barriers to enrollment, and those people who work on inclusion are well aware of this. So you have missing documents, birth certificates, proof of address, complex time-consuming processes, low trust, data security concerns, language not supported, device incompatibility. So there's a lot of stuff that we already know from what has been done in a detailed fashion in these 2 countries. And same thing in terms of barriers to use. We were talking yesterday, Professor Desai was talking about intra-household issues. So that goes straight to my heart, because as a micro-development economist, we are very interested generally in what happens in intra-household issues and power relations within the households. But anyway, so you can see all of these various barriers to use and barriers to employment to enrollment, we have to distinguish between those, right? And that's why we believe that this framework where you have these 5 steps in terms of DPI inclusivity, in terms of the measurement, that's the way we think you should really think about this. And it's essentially an O-ring production function again for inclusivity. The final thing that I want to talk to you about is to come back to AI and Richard Feynman and talk about my mandate, the international organization I run, which is social science research in general, but we worry about social science research in the Global South. So I'm an academic, or as I like to put it, I'm a recovering academic. Okay? So, which is sort of like being a recovering alcoholic, right? Yeah. We some of us could all sit down and say, "Hi, I'm Jean-Louis, and I'm an academic." Right? We could do an AA meeting. I've had 74 PhD students under my supervision. That's my total production so far, and still counting. And between 400 and 500 master's theses under my supervision. So I think I know something about how academic production happens. And most of these kids have been from the Global South. Most of them in the institutions where I've been. When you look at how an econ PhD student today gets trained and the tools that they're using, and you compare that to how an econ PhD student used to get trained just 2 years ago, it's night and day. It is night and day. When I see my kids today, what they're doing using Claude Code, right? I mean, it has changed things completely. Okay? So these are kids, the ones I'm talking about. So I teach in 2 places. I teach at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Okay, so we're talking about Switzerland. Okay, so no income issues there. And then I teach at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Rabat. It's funded by the OCP, by the phosphate company. So it's like a state within a state, 3 to 4% of GDP. So, there's no budget constraint there too. So they have access to all of the AI tools. Now picture a PhD student in Ouagadougou, or in Bamako, okay, or in Dakar. They don't have those same opportunities. They do not have those same opportunities. And what I want to make clear here is that the actual problem is not access to models per se. First of all, it's the complementary capital, because everyone can have access to the free level of ChatGPT or Claude, but it's complementary capital, institutional norms. How many PhD programs in economics or master programs in economics do you think there are in Guinea, right? Which are using Claude Code? Not many. I mean, these people they're not even using R. They may be starting to use Stata. So they're roughly a generation behind. And then the third thing has to do with peer networks, right? I mean, the whole sort of informal setup within an econ department. And this isn't true just in econ, right? I mean, when I talk to my friends in quantitative sociology or in poli-sci, et cetera, it's exactly the same thing. I'm talking from the economics perspective. And when you think of it, the O-rings logic for academic output, right, is exactly the same thing. Think of data, coding it, lit review, your academic network, right? How many times have we had to suck up to editors of various journals, right, and lick their boots so that we could actually get the paper into the journal that we wanted, right? And if we don't do it, tough luck, right? I think I have the record with my colleague Ugo Panizza for the quickest desk reject in history. So we have this paper which ended up getting a lot of traction. It's a paper called Too Much Finance, ? Which is in the Journal of Economic Growth. I mean, we got like 3,000 sites on this paper, okay? I think it's not a very good paper, but anyway, when we sent it to QJE, we got a desk reject from Robert Barrow in 90 minutes, saying this is not of general interest to our readers. So I'm not saying that he's eating his hat now, but it ended up getting a lot of traction. But that's what we're talking about, network. That's network right there. And when you think of the O-rings production function in terms of research and in terms of publication, 90% of economics research on the Global South is published by non-Global South researchers. It's as simple as that. And again, I'm not going to get into criticisms of, JPAL and IPA and things like that, although I would like to. Suddenly, you run the factory, you have, and I send my kids to go and, be slaves for JPAL and IPA. It's really good on a resume, right? But, they run an experiment. They find a really small p-value on some treatment. Then what happens? All the local researchers get relegated to a footnote on the first page of the paper and an acknowledgement, and then all the big guns from Cambridge, Mass come in, and then they become the authors of the paper. Okay? And I've seen this. I have a really nice counterfactual. This is anecdotal, but I have a colleague who, for family reasons, she was a professor in Canada in economics. She moved to Morocco, to UM6P in Rabat. Same person, okay? Just that her institutional affiliation is in the Global South. It's no longer in Canada. Her desk reject rate was multiplied by 3, right? Just because she's in the Global South. So yes, I sound like an activist because I am, but AI risks widening that gap. It risks widening that gap, and what can we do about it? So this is the current trajectory, essentially. We need to change a whole bunch of things. Among other things, there probably should be some kind of subsidization of researchers in the Global South. I mean, good luck in making that actually happen. I mean, look at this access to journals, but this is something where something could be done. And so, just the takeaway here. So first of all, go and listen to a Richard Feynman lecture. That's really worth it. So Los Alamos from below. The first thing is the Ashimoglu estimates, a lot of people, I think, believe are too small. I gave you a much larger number. That's probably too large a number, but it is completely conditioned by the production technology that is assumed. Assume a can opener. Right? Remember the horrible economics joke. First of all, second, DPI is obviously prerequisite of access to AI. I mean, that's part of the leitmotif that ran through all of this. We probably need some kind of Global South AI research fund, something like that. So that's part of my job, is to try to go out and see, can we mobilize resources so that researchers in the Global South actually get access to the same to the same resources as the global north. And then obviously the usual, again, this sometimes you feel you're flogging a dead horse, to quote the great British philosophers, the Sex Pistols. That's the title of one of their last albums, was "Flogging a Dead Horse." Wonderful title. Representation of Global South researchers and Global South in general and languages in training data and benchmarks. That also, and India can play a really big role in this. And I think that's, why is it not going forward? There should be one more slide. No? Okay. There we go. And that's my takeaway. And I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you. So I have a question, actually, in sort of the same spirit of with Marshall. In your production function on the research side, I think what's missing is the ability to ask the right question. Because what I'm seeing right now, and this is, of course, very, very early in, time will tell, the access to tools like Claude Code and others is actually probably associated with what I will call cognitive surrender, right? So people have, you can do so many things that you're not taking a step back to actually ask the right question, right? So it could be the case that your students who don't have access to these tools might, ask better questions and might do better research going on, because the other part is getting commoditized out there, right? Of course, there are disparities in access. I'm not diminishing that, but I feel that the premium of asking the right question is going to be even higher. Any thoughts?
Yeah, this is still wired.
This is working probably. Yeah.
Good point. I'm not sure whether I agree with it entirely. So the standard thing so I've had a lot of Chinese students. When I was in Geneva, I had a lot of Chinese students. And the self-criticism of Chinese PhD students in economics was always, we're really good technically, but we don't know how to think originally in terms of coming up with, a topic.
Yeah.
But that should be the job of the advisor, right? I mean, one of the things that Paul Krugman taught me when I was a kid was, if your advisor says you should work on this problem, listen to him or her. Even if you have something that you're passionate about, at least one of the papers, preferably two, listen to what your advisor says. So I'd say that the bottleneck there is the originality of thinking of the advisor. And I think that's also a bottleneck in places like Africa, south of the Sahara. But point taken in terms of AI.
So getting access to AI tools is going to be less of a problem than getting access to original research, because journals are getting more and more expensive. So I can actually imagine a researcher from Global South relying purely on AI to do most of the lit review and not reading the original material.
And that's sad, right?
That's very sad, but that is where perhaps the bigger problem is likely to occur, much less on the AI tool access.
I don't know, when it comes to coding and things like that, I mean, Claude Code, I mean, it's remarkable, right? I mean, I used to be a real geek and I love coding in R, and now I just don't waste my time doing it because, I give sort of general instructions because I know what I want. Point taken. But there's another barrier in a lot of parts of the global south. I'm born in the I may be Canadian, but I'm born in the Cameroon, so I have a slight Afrocentric side to me. In a lot of West African countries and East and Southern, well, any African country south of the Sahara, the DPI just isn't there. The DPI isn't there. So if you don't have the DPI, how can you access the AI? Right? I mean, just having a Zoom conversation with someone in Niamey, is incredibly complicated. Let me put it this way. Not that many years ago, I gave a lecture. I was teaching at Université Gaston Berger. It's in Saint Louis, which is the old colonial capital of Senegal, near the border with Mauritania. So I arrived to teach. Okay? So it's like 45 degrees. Obviously, the air conditioning is out. No problem. So I go to the whiteboard. Okay, with the and I want my felt pen. There is no felt pen. Right. So I say, okay, not a problem. we'll use an old-fashioned blackboard. I like blackboards. Who doesn't like blackboards? If you're a teacher, you love a blackboard, especially no chalk. Right? So no chalk. So what do? I take the kids outside. We go under a baobab tree, and this was basically a mathematical economics course. Actually, it was Holmstrom moral hazard type stuff. Okay, so you're doing the proof of Holmstrom moral hazard, and you're doing it with a stick in the sand under a baobab tree as herders are walking by. Best teaching experience of my whole life. Okay, that was like the best teaching. But that's DPI in northern Senegal. It'll work in Dakar. But if you're 15 kilometers outside the second city in Senegal, there ain't no DPI.
Okay, thanks a lot everyone for attending this talk, and thanks to Ravi and the other organizers for organizing this really nice conference. So I'm going to be presenting results from a field experiment. The question we're asking is, how do Google AI overviews affect publisher traffic? And as you might have guessed, it's not a very clever question. Like it's a first order question which a lot of people have been asking. What we're claiming is some of the cleanest causal evidence on this topic, and I'll provide more details on this as we go along. And of course, a joint work with Ananya, who's also sitting here. So firstly, I just like to thank folks at ISB for really funding this project. This is a project that tends to be very expensive. And so thanks to ISB for funding this project through multiple grants, and also my RA for being phenomenal support on this one. So I'm going to be talking about Google AI overviews. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with them, but just in case you're not. So initially, when you search for something on Google, you get the 8 or 10 standard blue links, and then you click on one or two of them, and that's how you continue your search. But now increasingly Google is integrating AI summaries into the search, and so all of this content comes from third parties. So Google is not really creating any of this content itself, but it's summarizing all of those content and serving it to you as a user. And of course, there are tons of citations on these AI summaries. So if you talk about the number of clickable links on the Google page, they've actually gone up. Like initially you had maybe 8 or 10, now you might have 20, because the number of links, etc., have gone up. But nonetheless, there are questions around the users in the search question being satisfied there itself, and so therefore they may not really have incentive to click downstream. And so broadly, the relationship between search engines and content producers has always been very symbiotic. So if you think about it, Google doesn't really produce any of its own content. It's basically a search engine. And so people, news providers, media houses, etc., they make content, and Google sort of organizes it together on its search page. And so the media houses, etc., they benefit by getting visibility. And Google, of course, benefits because when people come on the search page, then Google can also serve ads, which is Google's main business. So the relationship has been very symbiotic traditionally. However, now there is an increasing tension in this relationship, and there are concerns about value capture. And this is not a new concern, by the way. So these concerns have been around for the last 10 years or so. So Google has been featuring like knowledge graph elements. Like for instance, when you search for a restaurant, you get a lot of details there itself. You get reviews and you get maps, etc. Google started showing featured snippets some time back. So this conversation is not new, but the scale of proliferation of AI overviews has really hastened this conversation a lot. And so the concern is that these AI overviews may be stealing traffic in some sense from publishers. And so, of course, the concern here is of value capture and antitrust, which is that Google might be internalizing the benefits of content consumption while externalizing the costs of content production. And so we are increasingly seeing policy action against Google on this. So in the UK and very recently in the Brazil as well, some antitrust cases against Google have been launched. And of course, there have been lawsuits from individual publishers as well, the most famous one being by Chegg. So it is said that Chegg's business has been wiped out by a bunch of these AI tools, and one of them is also Google AI overviews. And so, of course, I already sort of briefly mentioned about this. So now in this paper, we are going to be providing. So the main contribution that we're claiming is to provide some of the cleanest causal evidence on this topic. Now, there have been a ton of policy reports and people independently comparing queries where AI overviews are shown to queries where AI overviews are not shown. But those comparisons are not very causal because these queries are also very different in many different dimensions. And so what we do is we run a field experiment. And so I'll talk about the setup that we had. So we had to build a custom browser extension. So for those of you who are not familiar with an extension, if you ever use like an ad blocker, or for instance, even by the other name for an extension is a plugin. So like if you use one of these Grammarly plugins, etc. So while you're browsing, these work in the background and they can do a bunch of stuff for you. So we had to build one of these, and so just like there is an app store for mobiles, there is an extension store for the Chrome web. And so we had to build this extension, submit it to Google for policy compliance review, etc. And once Google approves the extension that we have, that okay, we're not really doing anything fishy with it, then it gets uploaded on the place on the Chrome web store, and then users are free to download and install it. Of course, why would anyone install my extension? So we had to pay people to take part in the study. So we recruited about 1,100 people roughly on Prolific. And so, of course, this is where a bunch of the research funds went in, which is that we had to pay them sufficiently because we are getting great visibility into what they're doing online. So basically, every single URL visit that they're making, every single scroll that they're making. So for instance, if someone lands on a particular page and makes 5 down scrolls and 3 up scrolls, I get 8 entries in my data. Every single click that they make, whether it's a left click, whether it's a right click, every single tab shift that they make, and so on. So there's a lot of passive data collection which is going on. And so when we recruited people, of course, we had IRB compliance and everything else. And we told people that, you know what, this is the kind of data that we're collecting. And so, of course, there is some undeniable selection here of people who are choosing to participate. So the extension does two things. One is that it collects passive data, what I just mentioned. And the other is that we can actually deliver manipulations. And this is where it gets really powerful because a lot of times, like, we want to ask questions like these, which and the companies don't really have the proper incentive to collaborate with you and answer these questions. So rather than waiting to collaborate with a company to run some of these experiments, we can actually intervene on these different platforms without actually having to collaborate. And so what we did was we had 3 different groups in the study. The control group saw the Google page as usual. There was no change. We just passively collected data. This was 36% of the entire sample. Then we had the hide AI overview group. And so what we did here is that the AI overviews are hidden and everything else is moved up at the top. And this is a very seamless process. Like, there is no lag, and that is really important to maintain identical search experience. And so that's the other 36%. And then the third condition, so this was meant to be more exploratory. So which is why we had a small share, 28% of all the users. They were assigned to AI mode as a default. So any search that they make, people would be redirected to AI mode and they would not see the standard Google at all. Now, we intended this one to be exploratory, and that's why we put less traffic here. And one reason for that is that we expected a lot of attrition in this arm, because for 2 weeks, and we were just paying people like $10 or $11 to keep this on for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, people cannot use standard Google at all. They absolutely have to use the AI mode. And so, yeah, we did expect people to sort of not comply with the treatment here. And that's exactly what we see. If we look at survival rate of our participants over time, so 2 weeks is what we asked them to keep the extension on for. And that's the red line here. And so the color convention I'll be following throughout this presentation is blue is going to be the standard control group. Red is the group where we deliver the main intervention where the AI overviews were hidden. And green is the AI mode group. And as expected, we see a huge attrition in the AI group, which we also believe is a bit of a result that telling us that people are not probably if you force people to use the AI interface, they don't really like it. Yeah, people can choose to use it whenever they like for a particular kind of query, but if you force it on people, they probably don't really like it. And on day 14, which is when the promised 2 week period ended, we delivered the bonuses, etc. But you might wonder, like, what's happening after the 2 weeks. So a lot of these users actually continue to keep our extension. They were generous enough to let us keep observing them. And so we continue to observe them. And for the treatment and the control group, we actually switched the treatment status to get some within user estimates as well. So, so now what I'll be showing you right now are estimates at the search level. So we saw a bunch of searches that our users made, and in total we saw about 69,000 searches made by our participants in the 2-week period. And so now conditional on a search happening, what kind of click-through rates do we see, etc. So that's the first thing I'll be talking about. And then of course you might wonder that all of these results are conditional on a search happening. What if AI overviews lead people to search more, for instance? And so I'll talk about that towards the end. So firstly, in terms of the prevalence of AI overviews itself, so what we see is that in about 42% of the queries, AI overviews were intended to be triggered. So why I'm using the word intended to be triggered? Because for the control group, they were actually triggered, but for the treatment group, we actually hid the AI overviews. They were not actually triggered. But for about 60% of the queries, Google never really intended to even show an AI overview. And so our analysis will follow a similar split, which is that we expect our intervention to show effects here, but where AI overviews are not even triggered, our treatment and control groups are basically the same. And so therefore, we should not really see an effect here. And this basically serves as a placebo. And so talking about the main baseline results, so the first thing that we track is the total number of external clicks that Google sends to third-party websites. And we see that when we hide AI overviews, the total number of external clicks shoots up from 0.37 to 0.62. And this is a pretty significant increase. Like if we look at this as a baseline, the number comes out to be around 40% of all the clicks. And now the other measure that we track, which is sort of like a variant of the total number of external clicks, which is the likelihood of an external click happening. And we see that when AI overviews are shown, the likelihood of a zero-click search. So the likelihood that the search does not send an external click. And that is at 73% when AI overviews are shown. So when AI overviews are shown, 73% of the times, users don't click out. However, when we just hide the AI overviews and keep everything else the same, that number drops to 54%. And so definitely we see a huge impact in terms of outgoing traffic. When we look at the same for sponsored clicks, we actually don't see an effect, and these numbers are also really small. So like 2% was the click-through rate in the control group, and that remains exactly the same at 2% in the hide group. These are all search queries where AI overviews were intended to be triggered. Now talking about the placebo group where Google did not intend to show any AI overviews, we see null effects throughout. This is convincing us that, okay, what we are measuring are true causal estimates. Now the next part of this narrative is that, okay, Google is sending fewer clicks to outside websites, but it's possible that the residual clicks are of higher quality. And of course, quality is really hard to measure, and there are multiple dimensions to quality. But using our extension, we are able to get at some of them. But of course, these are not the only measures of quality. For instance, conversion rates, etc., we're not really able to talk about. But what we talk about is how much time are people spending on the page once they land on the page. Uh, After landing on a page, how likely are they to press the back button and go back to Google, indicating that the search experience was probably incomplete? And how likely are they to make some navigations inside the page where they actually land on? And so we actually do not see any effects for any of these. So this entire analysis is conditional on clicks. And we see that if we look at bounce, which is that someone lands on a clicked website and then they leave within 10 seconds of landing, it is pretty much similar in the treatment and the control group. The probability of them pressing back and going back to Google search is also nearly identical. And the probability that they take some action inside the website that they land on is also very similar. And so this is sort of suggesting that that the narrative that Google is probably sending higher quality clicks, at least it's not really supported in our data. Although the caveat is that there are many different measures of engagement like conversion rates, which we're not really able to measure. And now talking about the third AI mode group, which I said was more exploratory. So here I don't really have splits in terms of queries where AI overviews are shown and not shown because there are no AI overviews in AI mode. We just have all the search queries in the control group here, all the search queries in the treatment group, and all the search queries in the AI mode group. And we see that in AI mode, the number of external clicks are actually much, much smaller than even the control group where AI overviews are shown. And the likelihood of a zero-click search is the highest here. And so, as we go towards more AI-mediated search, the concern here, of course, is that that people will get all the content that they require there, and the question that this raises is that couple of questions. First is that okay, maybe consumers are better off. Like maybe they really like the search experience, so maybe from the consumer's point of view, there are some efficiency gains. Uh, Secondly, the question it raises is what about incentives for content production in the long run? Like if as a content producer, I'm not getting visits, so then how does it affect my incentives to produce content? These are open questions, but we do try to look at the consumer side of it. And so after the 2-week period was over, we had an online survey where we posted some questions to the users who participated in the study, and we asked them how did they feel about the overall search experience in the last 2 weeks. And so there were 3 broad metrics that we were tracking. The first question was related to their overall satisfaction with Google search, and the responses were on a 5-point Likert scale. We asked them about the quality of information that they found on Google in the last 2 weeks, and we also asked them about their ease of finding information on Google. Now, AI mode scores the lowest in all the 3. However, the key point here is that there is no shift in terms of user satisfaction. Like even when we hit the AI overviews, users seem to be indifferent. It hasn't affected the quality of their search experience. And so the main point here is that although there's a huge cost to the ecosystem, it doesn't appear as if users are really valuing this a whole lot, at least based on the data that we have. And of course, then these are all, I mean, the results that I showed you were all conditional on a search happening. Now, you could argue that maybe AI overviews are leading people to search more overall. And so what we have here is these regressions are at the user day level. Okay, so this is not conditional on a search. In fact, the dependent variable is the total searches, and we see that in the main treatment group relative to the control, there is no significant difference in the number of searches that people make. However, there is a huge increase in the number of external clicks that happen in the main treatment group for queries where AI overviews are triggered. For queries where AI overviews are not triggered, we do not see any change. And so it's really not as if AI overviews are sort of increasing the pie in terms of the number of searches that people are making. Next, I'll just be presenting some heterogeneity results. So one feature of the AI overviews is that they don't always appear at the top of the page. And so the data that we collected also included details on exactly where the AI overviews were shown. And so we see that in about 88% of the instances, the AI overviews were shown right at the top. So position 0, which is prime real estate. However, position 2, 3, 4, etc. Also saw some prevalence of AI overviews. And so what we're doing next is that we're looking at how do these effects differ depending on the position. And given this distribution, we just have 2 splits. The first is whether AI overviews were shown right at the top, and the other is all other positions put together. And of course, the fact that we have balance, the fact that we have balance between treatment and control again tells us that we don't really have other differences going on between the treatment and the control groups. And so we see that when AI overviews appear at a lower position, we basically see no effects in external clicks. However, when AI overviews appear at position 0, the effect is nearly a doubling of the clicks when we hide them. And so a lot of these effects that we're seeing is actually driven by the position where they appear. Again, the caveat here is that we are measuring heterogeneity with respect to position, not the causal effect of position itself, because position is not randomized. The queries which show up with AI overview at position 0 might be very different from queries where they appear lower. However, I think this is definitely suggesting some more evidence required on the position effects of AI overviews. And next we looked at prevalence by topic. So there's a lot going on in this graph. I'll just break it down. So we have basically plotted 2 things here. So firstly, we have classified the different search queries that people make into different topics. And then we have plotted 2 things for every topic. So the length of the bar shows us the prevalence of AI overviews for those particular topics. So for instance, health and science had the highest prevalence of AI overviews at almost 65-70%. And some of these topics had, like shopping, sports, etc., had some of the lowest prevalence of AI overviews. And also the bars, the shade of these bars represents the actual distribution of searches for each of these topics. So arts and entertainment is the most popular topic in our searches. Like people really like to search about celebrities and so on. And of course, health, science are all very popular. So we see that AI overviews are coming up a lot in like informational sort of queries where people are asking for some information. So we tried looking at effects in each of these different categories. Because of not having enough power, we cannot sort of distinguish between the effects across these different categories, but we find effects overall throughout. Like there is no category which is not seeing effects, but it's hard for us to tell which is seeing more, which is seeing less. And so I told you that after the 2-week period was over, we also switched the treatment and the control groups, and we also see the effects switching. So this one here is so initially they had high external clicks. This was the group where we hit the AI overviews. When we switched them, when we started showing AI overviews, external clicks dropped and zero click search increased. And this was initially the control group. When we switched them, they became their clicks really went up. So, and we also have user fixed effects here. So this is telling us that the effects we have are strongly causal. And so, yeah, the main point is that AI overviews are definitely leading to a huge decline in traffic for publishers. However, they don't seem to be improving user experience a whole lot. Users seem to be indifferent. And so, yeah, it's definitely worth talking about the long-term implications of this for incentives for content production. That's all.
Thanks, Saharsh. So, yeah, Ananda, I'm not surprised you have a question. Go ahead.
I guess it's maybe more of a comment, but perhaps a question. So I think, first of all, very interesting work. I understand it's important to look at clicks as a measure and sort of make the connection with that with content publishers' incentives. Another dimension to keep in mind when it comes to content publishers is that they're also interested in the quality of the traffic that's coming. So one of the things that we've seen in other contexts is while clicks may have actually reduced because of AI overview, the quality of traffic, because there's some people who will still engage with the links after they see the AI overview, even though there are fewer numbers, but the quality of the people coming to the website, the publisher is much higher. And so from a content publisher's perspective, they have to evaluate both perspectives. So from a broader antitrust issue, it still is an empirical question whether Google AI overview is necessarily detrimental to content publishers, because until you evaluate the other forms of engagement, it's hard to come up with a conclusive answer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so I'll have to go back to my slides. So we did have a set of analysis on the quality of the clicks. So we tracked 3 or 4 things, which is number one, the total time that people are spending on the clicked website, conditional on clicking. And we are also tracking, after clicking to a particular website, how likely are they to press the back button and go back to Google search, implying that their search experience is probably not complete yet. And the third thing that we're tracking is, after landing on the clicked website, how likely are they to take some action inside, which is the probability of an internal navigation. Now, of course, I mean, these are not complete. There are way more comprehensive measures of like quality, like for instance, conversion. We don't have those. However, we don't really see effects for those in our data. We see that all of these are fairly similar. So if you look at bounce rates, 20% of the clicks end up in a bounce less than 10 seconds, and this is the same in the treatment and the control. The likelihood of back to search was surprisingly high at 40%. Like 40% of the search of the clicks lead people to click back to Google, and that's also the same in both of these. And similarly for internal navigation. So at least we don't find evidence. I know that there is discussion going on in that space, but at least we don't find evidence of that here.
This is great. Just a very quick follow-up. One of the studies we've seen is the prices that advertisers on content publisher sites can extract is now increasing because of the increase in the quality of the traffic. So for the publishers, it becomes the combination of the volume of ad traffic going down, but the quality of the ad traffic going up. So revenues may still go up.
So that's through better conversion.
Correct.
So you get more intent.
More intense of
And,
prices.
and
go
Saharsh, I
up.
think you could pick that up if you look at the, so one way to do heterogeneity here would be where in the funnel the consumer searches, right? Is it a broad exploratory search versus,
So we
more like targeted search? Because then you have more conversion, right, at the end.
Yeah, we sort of done that. Like I haven't shown it here, but we have query splits, which is like, is the query an informational query? Is it more of a transactional query? So we've looked at effects by that. AI overviews are mostly shown in informational queries. This is a transactional query. Google is not really showing AI overviews that much. But yeah, it's something we can look at in more detail. And Anandu, I'll talk to you separately as well.
Venkatesh and John. Yeah.
Slightly away wisdom. What is the demographic
Oh, yeah. So
population of your 1100? And the second one also I'll ask that's a standard error, right? Your error.
yeah, correct.
They are so tight and every one of them with 1100 population for all
No, so
features.
so these are 1100 users, but these are all at the search level. So like we have 70,000 searches. And so if you split the 70,000 searches, we have a lot of numbers in both the groups. However, the satisfaction numbers, these are all using only user level data, but these confidence intervals are still tight because there's not a lot of variation in this particular measure. So that's on the confidence intervals. For the demographics,
Does it imply homogeneity of the 1100 people who were searching? That's why I asked the question, what is the demographic?
So this is profile.
so
Talk about the sample, I guess, maybe a little bit. Yeah.
So, yeah, ideally, I would have really liked people in the wild to adopt our extension, but yeah, like why would people do it? So, there are these paid platforms where you recruit people to take part in your studies, and so these are all people in the US. So we paid them a certain fee. They installed our extension. However, the good thing here is that it was a very natural setting. So we weren't asking them specific questions. Okay, here is a search. What would you do? We were just observing their click behavior for 2 weeks in the background. So that makes it very natural. However, these people were recruited for the particular research study and they're signed up in exchange for compensation. So yeah.
These are correlated. So, I mean, were they bots to be able? So, could there be a bot in the process? That's what. Let's say
Well, let's not get into the the weeds of this. Maybe go ahead. Yeah, John. Maybe one broader question, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, actually, it's just a suggestion. So I'd be really worried about heterogeneity of treatment effects. And I'm talking about Heckman-style marginal treatment effects, right? So a marginal treatment effect is the effect of being treated for a person who is indifferent, who has unobservables such that he or she is indifferent between being treated and not being treated. And all of these kinds of RCTs basically assume that that's the same for everyone. And I would assume in this context that there's a lot of heterogeneity. And the way you could do that is there are mechanisms. There's an AER paper back in, I think it's actually 2012 that it came out, where what you basically do is you ask people, how much would I have to pay you to take part in this experiment? And then you draw a random price. And if the random price is higher than what the person wants to be paid to participate, and that allows you, I'll give you the reference, that allows you to back out the marginal treatment effect.
So yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. Speaking of paying people, I think we have the perfect segue to Avi's talk.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Avi. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon. I'm also currently spending some time at OpenAI, but I don't have results yet from the work I'm doing there. So today I'm going to present some of my other work. So today I'm going to present some results from a few different pieces, like an op-ed, as well as a couple of papers I wrote recently. This is very complementary to the talk by Jean-Louis earlier. So Jean-Louis was talking about the production side, right? And today in my work, I'm going to talk about the welfare side. The point I'm going to make is that on the production side, the impact of AI as of now is quite limited, if there is any impact, or maybe even zero. But on the welfare side, the impact is quite substantial if you measure it. And so in this work, so I'm going to put out some numbers where we're trying to quantify all the benefits users are already getting from using these generative AI tools, even if there is no impact yet on productivity, more research papers and things like that. So I'm going to give you some preliminary numbers about the consumer surplus being generated by generative AI tools in the US. And then for the purpose of this conference, I did some quick studies trying to quantify that for India as well. The amazing thing about AI is it lets you do studies quickly and it lets you analyze data quickly. So some of the regressions for India, I was just running today morning, thanks to Codex. Yeah. No, yet. So the papers are not yet getting published because, of the review process and all that. So that will take time. But again, right, the welfare is clearly increasing, right? I could do this quickly now today, and I couldn't do that like a few years back. I'm also going to talk about implications for inequality. So Jean-Louis was talking about inequality from an income perspective. I'm going to talk about inequality from a welfare perspective. So the consumer surplus, different users like lower income versus higher income groups within and across countries are getting from these digital tools. And finally, I'm also going to show some numbers about how much of this surplus is, as of today, being captured by these AI platforms and how much of it goes to consumers. So the motivation for this work is essentially also the motivation for a lot of my other work, which is, we've seen, of course, the solo paradox, right? In the 80s, when computers were everywhere except in macroeconomic statistics. And this is also the case today now for AI, right? AI is everywhere. I'm sure all of us in this room are using it. But, it's not meant to show up, right, in productivity, GDP, and so on. Today, it will eventually show up, hopefully, but as of today, it's not meant to show up. But, if you look at adoption, right, adoption is clearly massive, right? ChatGPT, it's the steepest adoption curve ever in history, way faster than, what we saw with Netflix, Twitter, or Instagram, or any of these other apps which we know from before. In the US context, 56% of American adults use some sort of generative AI tool actively every week. Again, if you look at the adoption has been steeper than the adoption of computers and internet and mobile phones. So way steeper adoption than we saw with these earlier waves of technology. If you look at ChatGPT adoption, as of late last year, 1/10 of all of humanity, like 800 million users, use ChatGPT every week, so weekly active users. And this was as of late last year. Today, I think that number is probably close to 1 billion. But if you look at the productivity impact, right? We saw Jean-Louis, talk where we saw some of the predictions from Daron Acemoglu, more on the pessimistic side. If you look at the spectrum of predictions, there are some quite optimistic predictions, usually people from industry who clearly have a conflict of interest. So Dario Amodei predicts that we're going to see 5 to 10% growth, which is, I think, crazy. I wouldn't bet on that. And then you have a bunch of other people in the middle. There's also some interesting work being done by the Forecasting Research Institute, where they're trying to essentially collect these predictions from a bunch of people, so economists, but also AI experts, but also general public. I was one of the panelists, as an economist. Maybe some of you in this room are also in this sample. But essentially, if you look at the data from across a broad range of people, rather than just Daron or just Dario, even though everyone expects from a technical perspective that AI is going to have significant, impact, significant progress in terms of technical features, the impact on productivity is going to be important, but not like 5-10%. So even in the most optimistic case, it's closer to historical trends. So maybe 1% additional growth beyond what we are seeing without AI. And by the way, 1%, right, is already huge. But maybe it's not going to be 5 or 10%. So this was a very interesting paper, just came out this week as an NBR working paper from some faculty who collaborated with Microsoft Research and had access to internal GitHub data. So even in sectors like coding, where there is extremely high adoption of AI, depending on what outcome variable you look at, you can see very high productivity impacts, or you can see more modest productivity impacts. So if you look at like the earlier stage of this pipeline, right, of writing code, so if you look at things like lines of code, we are seeing like 200, 300% increase in productivity. But if you go down the funnel, if you look at actual number of new apps being released and things like that, the impact is more modest, more like 20 to 30% more apps on the App Store, once AI tools came out. But if you look at actual usage of these apps, it's essentially zero. Like, there is no impact yet. Like, no one is using these AI generated apps yet. So, so even in like high adoption industries, as of today, there is no productivity impact according to the data we have. And this, so the point here which I'm trying to make is, so how do we reconcile on one hand massive adoption already today and all the amazing things we can do with AI, but on the other hand, no productivity impact as of today. And the reason for that, right, is, productivity and welfare are different things. They measure different things. Oftentimes they could be correlated. But when it comes to these digital technologies, oftentimes what I find in my work and also others have found is they need not always be correlated. So you could have massive increase in consumer surplus, more limited impact on productivity. And for this reason, it's essential if you want to there's a saying, right? You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So we really care about welfare, but if you don't measure it, then you really cannot manage it. And that's essentially the motivation for this work. And we're trying to measure the consumer surplus, the welfare gains users are getting from these generative AI tools. So this is, I think, especially important for LLMs, because if you look at usage of ChatGPT and split it based on work versus non-work use, majority of the use is non-work. So 70% of usage of ChatGPT is for non-work activities. So this is never going to show up in productivity benefits because you're not using it for work, but it's going to show up as increase in consumer surplus. Okay, so what are we doing? So in my work, which I think many academics in this room may have heard before at conferences, but what we're trying to do is trying to measure consumer welfare directly as opposed to trying to infer it from productivity and other macroeconomic metrics. And the way we do this is by running lots of these large-scale online choice experiments, essentially trying to estimate, how much people value these tools, or rather, how much is people's willingness to accept to give up access to these tools. So this is what we did with generative AI tools. So what we did essentially is, let's say you are adopting generative AI already. So you're using, ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini and so on. If I paid you, let's say, like $10, would you stop using these tools for a month? One of you may get the $10 option, someone else may get $500, someone else may get $1,000. And you can do these sorts of experiments and see if your valuation is above or below that particular price level. And you can do this for thousands of people and aggregate data from them. And then you can estimate the demand curve for generative AI tools. And you can measure also the consumer surplus users are getting from these tools. So this is what we did for generative AI tools. And so essentially, we did two waves of data collection. So we did this same experiment last year and again repeated it this year. So far, these are just simple surveys. So in ongoing work, I'm doing this with incentive compatibility. So actually giving them cash offers, actually following up. But this is preliminary data where we're just doing simple surveys. But we did the same survey last year and the same survey this year. What we find is, compared to last year when we did this study, in the US, the average user of generative AI tools valued it at around $100 for a month of it. So we had to pay them $100 for them to stop using these tools for a month. This year, that number went from $100 to around $125. This is the average. The median valuations are still quite low. Median valuations went from around $3 to around $11. The reason for this is, you have these power users who really, like many of us in this room assume, I cannot live without Gen AI. And I don't know what I would do like for my teaching and research if I couldn't use any of these tools. So the averages are quite significant. The medians are more modest, but they're still substantial at the population level. And the growth from last year to this year has been quite substantial. So when we, back out the consumer surplus estimates, so from last year to this year in the US, consumer surplus went from around $116 billion to around $172 billion. So over 50% growth, in just a year. So this is because of more people using it and existing users figuring out more clever use cases and increasing their valuations. So are these numbers high or low? So to put these some of these numbers in context, I'm going to show some of my earlier work where we did this before GenAI came out, but for other types of digital goods, like search engines, e-commerce apps, Google Maps, and so on. So in my earlier work, I did several studies where we collaborated with Meta, and we could do these choice experiments directly on the newsfeed with Facebook users with incentive compatibility. So not just simple surveys, but actually following up with them, giving them cash offers, making them deactivate their Facebook, WhatsApp, or Instagram accounts. We also had a clever way to back out valuations for non-Meta apps, even when we couldn't do this deactivation. For more details, you can look it up in the paper. But essentially, we did this, for all popular digital goods across a bunch of countries. So this is what, we had for US. So in the US in 2022, when I did this experiment with Meta, Google Search was the most valued product. So, around $100 per month to give up access to Google Search. You could use a substitute. So this is like the extra value users are getting beyond, what they could get from Bing and so on. Things like YouTube and Google Maps are also quite substantial. So when I put that generative AI median valuation in context, so today generative AI is, similar in terms of impact on consumer surplus as, Twitter and Snapchat. So it's substantial, but it's still not as big as, what Google Search was. Maybe Google Search would have gone down today compared to a few years back, but I would expect it to be still substantial. It's still not of the level of, streaming apps like YouTube or Google Maps or e-commerce apps. It's now comparable to Snapchat and Twitter, but the growth has been quite significant. So 50% from last year to this year. So I would predict, that this would keep on increasing for the next few years. So some interesting stuff we also did with Meta was we had a bunch of rich data. So we could look at, their income levels. We could look at their location. We could compare consumer surplus across different individuals within the countries, across different income levels. We could also look at the national level across different countries, how much consumer surplus has been generated by digital technologies. And what we find from that analysis is that, when we look at absolute valuations of, here I'm showing you data for social media, but we find something very similar also for search engines and messaging apps and so on, is even in terms of absolute dollars, people in, lower income individuals and higher income individuals get around similar levels of consumer surplus. And this was for social media, but we find very similar results for search engines, e-commerce apps, and so on. And what this means is, that relative to your income, conditional on adoption, so you need to have adopted these tools. So conditional on adoption relative to your income, lower income individuals seem to get much more consumer surplus from these tools compared to higher income individuals. But again, this is conditional on adoption. So if you're not adopting, if you're not using it, then you're not, of course, getting the consumer surplus. This was within countries. We also looked at across several countries, and what we found is, some of the lower income countries in our sample, like Mexico. So we didn't have India in our sample, but we had, Mexico in our sample. So in Mexico, the consumer surplus from these popular digital goods as a percentage of their GDP per capita, adjusted for PPP, was like around 20 to 25%. In the US, it was more like 7 to 8%. So even when we look at across countries, what we found is, some of the lower income countries in our sample get disproportionately more consumer surplus relative to their income compared to some of the higher income countries in our sample. So this was a surprising result, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it, right? So one of the most beautiful thing about digital technologies is everyone has, once you have access to it, if it's free, then you get access to it. If it's paid, once you're assuming you are able to pay for it, once you get access to the tool, the quality is the same no matter if you are in India or in the US, no matter if you're lower income or higher income. It's not like if you're richer, right? You get a better Google search or a better WhatsApp. You get the same quality WhatsApp, you get the same Google search, you get the same Google Maps. And this is also true for AI, right? Like, even if you're sitting in India or if you're sitting in the US, the free version of ChatGPT is the same. It's not like it's worse in India compared to US. Again, this is, as let's conditioning on, let's say, everyone, users using it in English. We know from yesterday and so on, like, it gets worse once we focus on regional languages. But if we restrict our attention to adopters in India versus US, no matter where you are, you get access to the same AI tool. And this is very different to how it was even 5 years back. 5 years back, if you wanted the frontier AI tools, you had to be at CMU or MIT or a few different institutions. Today, like, for the $200 version can like do so much for you, right? Like, I mean, it's essentially as powerful as what, anyone else in the world has access to. So, yeah, so we also did some calculations trying to see, out of the total surplus being created, how much of it gets captured by the platforms, how much of it goes to consumers. As of today, majority of these gains seem to go to consumers. There is no good data on revenue on the user side, how much money ChatGPT and Claude makes from pro subscriptions. We have data on their total revenue. A lot of that revenue is enterprise use. But even if we take that global revenues from all of these AI companies, last year it was around $14 billion. The consumer surplus just in the US was almost 12x that. So, so majority of the gains today go to consumers. Small share gets captured by platforms. So I was telling this to someone yesterday, today, like, AI feels like how, I don't know in the Indian context, but in the US context, around 2014, 2015, around that time, if you wanted to take an Uber, it was so cheap. You could spend $2 or $3, get an Uber pool in Boston, go across the whole city. Uber was losing money on every ride. All these rides were, heavily subsidized by venture capitalists. And today, as of now, we are still in that world, right, with AI, where consumers, those who are adopting, again, those who are using them, can get all the surplus. The platforms are not really capturing much. They're losing billions of dollars every year. Okay, so some quick results about, when I was just looking at the Indian context for the purpose of this workshop. So I was trying to get adoption data. I think the best data I could find is OpenAI has signals data, which is publicly available, where they have some aggregate data. So in India, around, 100 million weekly active users of ChatGPT. So 10% of all Indian internet users use ChatGPT every week. This is OpenAI's, fastest growing market worldwide. For ChatGPT, 3x growth, year on year. For Codex, it's 27x. It's the levels are still low, but the growth is massive. Same with Anthropic, after US Claude users, number 2 in the world. However, almost all of these, or a majority of these users are, as of today, in the major cities, are, high-skilled workers, higher educated users. So it's not like, the average person is using it yet. So it's still concentrated among higher educated people living in the major cities. So in some of my own surveys, we were trying to look at online freelancers and measuring their AI adoption. One super interesting result I found is when we were surveying Upworkers, AI adoption among Upworkers in India is 100%. Like, we didn't find a single Upworker who doesn't use AI. Every Upworker who from India who is, essentially uses AI. In the US, it's more like 60%. So not all American Upworkers use AI. And the reason, again, right, like if you're an Indian Upworker, like you kind of, most of the jobs are like coding related, and you have to use AI to do these jobs. So the necessity is much larger. So the adoption is also significantly higher for this subgroup. When we did the same kind of, willingness to accept studies in India, among users, the number was like around 5,000 rupees. So among users, among active users of AI, we had to pay the average person around 5,000 rupees so that they stop using these AI tools for a month. So around $50 a month. So, quite substantial. And so when I convert that, to the national level, so, again, this is an approximate figure. This is a quick study. So, we need to do this more carefully. But just looking at the ballpark figure, it's around $60 billion annual consumer surplus from these generative AI tools in India as of today. And when we look at, the consumer surplus figure relative to income, again, in the US, it was more like 1.2%. In India, it's again, closer to 6%. So again, but again, the caveat again is these are conditional on adoption. If you're using it, then you get much more value here compared to there relative to your income. And when we look at how much revenue goes to consumers, 99% of the value seems to go to consumers. Only 1% gets captured by the platforms in India today. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, but the point I'm trying to make is, so the welfare gains from these tools are immediate if you measure it. The productivity benefits are going to show up with a lag. They could be more limited, they could be large, we don't know yet. But the welfare side, the gains are significant. They're already showing up if you go and measure it. So the takeaway, is, at least in my view, is at least for the Indian context, you really have to boost adoption. Because the growth in welfare, if you take, let's say, adoption from 10% to 100%, is going to be quite substantial. But how do you do this adoption, right? So we were doing some pilot studies, and what we found is you cannot just give away access to these tools. No one is going to use them. So you need to have training programs where you give specific use cases which they can apply to their everyday life and improve their life. And when you give such specific training programs, then we see massive, quite significant adoption. And, this is something Singapore is doing, so they're giving out access to pro versions of ChatGPT or Claude to every citizen, but you only get access to it once you finish this training program. So yeah, I'm going to stop here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Avi. Excellent. So, Anindya, I'm actually going to ask the first question here to the entire panel. So, Marshall, you started us off by, talking about the impact of AI on jobs, right? And that's something we haven't really gotten into, but we can't have this conference without having that conversation, right? So, if AI can do all the things that you showed, it is doing, right? And firms start thinking that, we don't really need entry-level workers. How do we sort of create the next workforce out there, right? So Manish's first job was shadowing a CEO in Hyderabad, right? And I think the things that he learned out there are probably a stepping stone to lots of other things out there. So any thoughts on that? I mean, if we kill this sort of learning ramp, what's going to happen to sort of the future of work in some senses, right?
So that's a very personal question. My middle son had exactly that issue. He was looking to go into law, and in order to get a job in law, what you want to do is to first be a paralegal. And guess what? That is bullseye, dead center for what Claude is able to do. It's the paralegal job. So those paralegal jobs are disappearing. Actually, I think one ray of hope is that is exactly what I think academia should be providing. As the lower rungs on the career ladder are disappearing thanks to generative AI, I think we in academia need to be providing access to internships, directly applying the skills that we teach to actually provide those lower rungs on the ladder. So my answer, I genuinely admit that is a problem. I think that's something we really need to be thinking about. But I think that's one opportunity for academia to step in and provide some of that. I think there'd be something, what we teach and what we should do with partnering with organizations so we can actually start to do that would be helping to provide those lower rungs.
Any thoughts from the other panelists on this?
One of the points of O-ring is wage inequality, right? Because given that you have a sort of matching, you're going to have high quality firms, right? If you just look within country, you're going to have high quality firms with the AI and the high quality workers, and then you're going to have low quality firms with very little AI and lower quality workers. So apart from the sort of getting rid of certain categories of workers, what it's also going to do is it's going to create a lot more heterogeneity, I think, in terms of wage structure in countries such as the U.S., but not just in the U.S. And there's already enough inequality in the world, but I think it's going to make it worse.
So one thing I think is going to be more and more important is apprenticeship programs, maybe potentially subsidized by the governments. But so the kind of entry-level job you're mentioning, right? Like I think the market may not have the demand to create those anymore, but that's where I guess policy would have to step in. And see this anecdotally in countries like Germany and Switzerland, which have very robust apprenticeship programs where the government subsidizes it in many contexts. And, if with that subsidy, firms may be happy to take in some of these entry-level workers, and you spend part-time while you're in school, spending few days at a company, and that could be, I think, the way to go. And India, I think, on paper has some of these programs, but they're seen as lower status compared to going straight to university, and I think we really need to remove that stigma.
Anindo, again, I think I saw your hand up, and then Pranav. And maybe we are actually at time, but I think we'll go for another 5 minutes and then get some coffee. Yeah.
So I guess my question was for Avi, you. So a couple of quick questions. Interesting work as always. The first question is, let's say we stick with the WTA metric. I'd be curious, as an extension, if you want to look at how those numbers change when you rephrase the question and split the sample between the free low quality version of Gen AI tools and the paid much higher quality version, because over time increasingly people realize there's tremendous differences between the paid and the free versions. So that's the first part. The second question is maybe broader, which is, as I'm sure you know this, between the literature on compensating variation and equivalent variation, there are differences in WTA versus WTP. And typically the WTP metrics tend to have lower estimates. So I'm curious if you've considered, not just in this paper, but also other papers, WTP, and if not, why not?
Great questions. So on the first question, yeah, I did look at the data, and the paid users, their consumer surplus is like an order of magnitude more, like 10x or even 100x, for a lot of them. They may pay like $20. Most of them are on the $20 plan, and they get like thousands of dollars of consumer surplus. So that difference is quite substantial. And on the WTP versus WTA point, I mean, point well taken. So my response to that is, a few things. So the first thing is the levels are less interesting rather than changes over time, or comparing across different apps, or comparing across different groups. And that's what, I've been trying to do in a lot of my work. So, when we look at, let's say, keeping WTA fixed last year versus this year, see this 50% growth. So I think there is more information in that rather than the absolute numbers. The other point is WTP for welfare measurement for digital goods. To do it carefully with incentive compatibility is just not possible, because you can do it maybe in a very artificial laboratory setting, but in the field, everyone has access to these tools for free. You cannot force them to pay for it. There are also like interesting behavioral biases. People are very hesitant to pay anything for digital goods. There's some interesting research which shows that the same product, let's say a song, if you sell a digital download versus the physical CD, people will pay like a few dollars or even tens of dollars if it's a popular artist. Digital download, it's essentially close to zero. So there are all those issues. But I think if we did WTP carefully with incentive compatibility, it would be lower than WTA, but it would still, in my view, I think it would still be substantial. And I think when we focus on changes in WTA and changes in WTP should be correlated. So yeah.
So I'll add to that. I mean, I think, first of all, ambitious project, right? I agree with Ananda. My first question was about the difference with WTA and WTP. But I think this is also going to be correlated with the salience of these tools itself, right? Because I do believe that over time, the salience of LLMs is going to be much more than social media or other networking tools, which will increase the gap between WTA and WTP. Right. So another way to think about this study could be, and maybe something to think about, is in a discrete choice setting, you ask people to make choices between different bundles of these tools, right? So you can think about putting social media apps, you can think about putting Claude or whatever LLMs, and then get at WTP measures, because that will get rid of this distinction between WTA and WTP, and also lower the salience, because right now you're just focusing on one particular tool and asking them about it, right? The third thing it probably does is it gets at the extensive margin as well, because right now all estimates are conditioned on people having access to them, right? Not about people who don't have access, right? So just some thoughts, I mean, might be helpful.
Yeah,
So
those are all great points. On your second point, I do have some analyses, not just looking at individual apps, but looking at bundles. And so I've done some of that work.
Sure.
But yeah, but point
happy
well
happy to
taken.
chat. No,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Shashwat, and then one more question, I think, then and it's time for a break. The lady at the back. Yeah.
So my question is for the broader panel. Clearly, AI is improving quite a lot, but most of its knowledge right now comes from combining human knowledge created over the years. So a natural limit on its scaling up is human expertise. Only a Terence Tao can verify a Terence Tao. In a world with where experts to verify AI's new knowledge created is limited, how do we get to that, very high speed or 30% productivity growth that John talked about?
Look, John, I think that's yours.
No. Yeah, I actually have something to say about.
Yeah. You've been the hard West.
You got the productivity actual numbers. I have a few theories on that, but what do you...
No, I mean, I don't know. Yes, there is an upper bound, presumably, and asymptotically, we should be going towards that upper bound. How far are we along that? That logistics curve or something like that.
So I'm going to provide a little bit of a contrarian perspective on that. So if you view the training purely in a Bayesian model of information, of course what you're doing is you're getting closer and closer and closer to some existing descriptive state of the world. But if you take the recombinant growth perspective, either Weitzman or Paul Romer or some others, look at how many new compounds Noam identified. Look at how many new compounds we're able to identify with protein folding. That allows you to create new options on new states of the world that didn't exist previously. That allows you to push the boundaries of the frontier, maybe in new combinations of new ways. So I'm optimistic we may not have hit that boundary as soon as you think that may happen. So it is the case that AI is already starting to prove math theorems on some puzzles that human beings had not yet solved. And I'm imagining that boundary may move farther along as you get more recombinations of the information rather than just descriptions of what we already know.
And I think if I may add, the runway is actually way longer than what we can think about right now. So the actual physical world, so if you think about like robots, right? We don't have a lot of training data. When you get to starting, modeling a robot with dexterity, that's just something that's just starting out, right? So if Jensen Huang talks a lot about that, right? The physical world, we don't have, training data for that yet, right? And I think that's the next frontier in some senses. So I actually think these numbers are low. Like we haven't fully thought through that. But you had a question, right? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this panel on AI humanity. I wanted to touch upon something because we have been discussing from deontology to anthropology. I wanted to ask, is AI DPI combined together the justification for energy footprint with everything that is contextualized is fair enough? Because as Professor Arcand said, there's a divide between global south and global north. With the amount of energy that is utilized to create these generative AI models, etc., don't you think it is going to create more margins and widen this gap at all?
I mean, I think, I learned from Manish that we tend to sort of, overestimate things in the short run and underestimate things in the long run, right? So I don't think the trade-off here is all the problems we won't solve if we don't have this technology out there, right? So when you bring that into the energy calculation, it looks very different than, like, will my utility bill go up tomorrow out there, right? So I think there are obviously concerns. So, you have to be thoughtful about where you put up a data center. I was talking about this yesterday, right? I don't think it's a big problem in Minnesota, right? I mean, we have tons of water. We have actually, tons of, cheap energy, in fact, as well. But maybe not in Arizona, right? Or in Rajasthan. So my sense is that I think I'm on the more on the optimistic side out there, right? That we
But
haven't solved all the problems we want to solve, and this is a technology that's going to do that, and the welfare gains of that are going to be like something that we haven't estimated right now, right? We can't project out that.
And exactly to add to your point, like, we need to make an informed decision about the trade-off. You need to also measure the benefits and the costs. But if you're not measuring on the benefits and only focus on the cost, then you wouldn't make that, optimal trade-off.
All right. I think on that note, thank you to the panelists, and very good session this morning.